Did you know that the coldest marriages sometimes burn the brightest? The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office on Fifth Avenue, each droplet racing down the glass like tears that refused to fall from her eyes. Elena Marquez sat perfectly still in the leather chair, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of practiced composure that comes from years of hiding what you really feel. Across the mahogany desk, her future husband signed document after document without looking up. The scratch of his pen was the only sound between them, rhythmic and cold, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. This was not how love stories were supposed to begin. Dominic Ashford finally looked up, and for just a moment, their eyes met. His were the color of storm clouds, gray and distant, holding secrets she couldn't begin to guess. He slid the contract across the polished wood toward her, and she noticed his fingers, long and precise. The hands of someone who had built an empire before the age of 35. The engagement ring he'd given her 2 days ago sat heavy on her finger, a flawless diamond that caught the dim office light and scattered it across the walls like broken promises. 2 years, he said, his voice low and measured. That's all I'm asking. Elena picked up the pen. The weight of it felt like the weight of her entire future, balanced on a point so sharp it could draw blood. She thought about her mother in the hospital, the machines beeping steadily, keeping time with a heart that was giving up. She thought about the medical bills stacked on her kitchen table, each one a small avalanche of numbers she couldn't climb. She thought about the call that had come 3 weeks ago, the stranger's voice on the other end offering her a solution wrapped in silk but lined with thorns. 2 years, she repeated, and signed her name. The contract was specific, brutal in its clarity. They would live together in his penthouse overlooking Central Park. They would attend social functions as a couple, maintain the appearance of legitimate marriage for his business partners, his board of directors, his grandmother who controlled the family trust with an iron will and traditional values that left no room for a bachelor CEO. In return, Elena would receive $2 million upon the marriage's dissolution, enough to save her mother and start over somewhere far from the city that had chewed her up and spit her out too many times to count. No emotional involvement, no falling in love. Those words were printed in black and white on page 7, clause 12, as if feelings were something you could legislate away with the right language and a notary stamp. The wedding was small, sterile, performed by a judge who seemed more interested in his lunch break than the vows they exchanged. Dominic's best man was his lawyer. Elena's witness was a paralegal she'd never met before. When the judge said, "You may kiss the bride," Dominic leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek, so brief and cold it felt like a handshake. She caught the scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive, cedar and smoke, and felt something twist in her chest that she immediately pushed down. This was business, nothing more. The penthouse was a museum of wealth, all glass and marble and art that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Elena stood in the doorway of what would be her bedroom, separate from his, connected by a shared living space that felt more like a neutral zone between warring countries. The city sprawled below them, millions of lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over Manhattan. Each one a story, a life, a dream being lived by someone who probably married for love. "The staff will help you settle in," Dominic said from behind her, already loosening his tie. "We have our first event tomorrow night. Charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum. My assistant will send over appropriate attire." He started to walk away, then paused. "Elena," she turned. "I know this isn't what either of us imagined," he said, and for just a second, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like regret. "But we both get what we need from this arrangement. Let's just make it through the 2 years without complications." Without complications. As if the human heart could be programmed like one of the algorithms that had made him rich. The first month was exactly as cold as the contract promised. They moved around each other like planets in fixed orbits, never touching, rarely speaking beyond what was necessary. At events, Dominic would place his hand on the small of her back, and she would lean into him just enough to sell the illusion. But the moment they stepped back into the penthouse, they would separate to their respective corners. He worked late into every night, the glow of his laptop screen visible under his door. She spent her evenings on the phone with her mother's nurses, monitoring vitals, adjusting medication schedules, praying to a God she wasn't sure listened to prayers made under false pretenses. But something began to shift in the spaces between the silence. It started small. She noticed he drank his coffee black, 3 cups before noon, and began leaving a fresh pot brewing when she heard him stirring in the morning. He noticed she loved old movies and started leaving classic films queued up on the television, titles she'd mentioned once in passing at a dinner party. Neither of them acknowledged these small gestures, but they accumulated like snow, soft and quiet, changing the landscape without anyone noticing until suddenly everything looked different. Then came the night of the storm. Elena woke to thunder that sounded like the sky was tearing itself apart. Lightning illuminated her room in violent flashes, and she lay there in the dark, heart racing, transported back to another storm years ago, another night when everything fell apart. She didn't realize she was crying until she heard the soft knock on her door. Elena Dominic's voice, uncertain. "Are you okay?" She couldn't answer. The door opened slowly, and he stood there in pajama pants and nothing else, his hair disheveled in a way she'd never seen, making him look younger, more human, less like the marble statue of success he presented to the world. He saw her face and didn't ask permission, just crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed. "I hate storms too," he said quietly, and just like that, the first crack appeared in the wall between them, and something warm began to seep through. They sat in the darkness together, neither speaking, just listening to the rain assault the windows like it was trying to break through. Thunder rolled across the city, and Elena felt her breathing slowly return to normal, syncing somehow with the steady rhythm of Dominic's presence beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty reassurances, just existed there in the space where she was breaking, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. "When I was 8, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the storm, "my father took me sailing. He loved the water, said it was the only place he felt free from the weight of the family name, from the expectations." He paused, and Elena turned to look at his profile in the darkness, the sharp line of his jaw, the way shadows pooled in the hollow of his throat. "We were caught in a squall, the boat capsized. I watched him go under, watched the waves take him, and I couldn't do anything but hold on to the hull and scream into a sky that didn't care." Elena's breath caught. "Dominic, they found me 6 hours later. Coast Guard pulled me out hypothermic, barely conscious. But they never found him." He turned to her then, and in another flash of lightning, she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "I was groomed to take over the company before I could even understand what it meant. Every decision I've made since that day has been about proving I was worth saving, worth more than he was." She understood then, in a way that went deeper than words, why he'd needed this arrangement, why a marriage for love was something he couldn't afford. Love meant vulnerability, meant risking the kind of loss that had shaped his entire existence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and reached out, her hand finding his in the darkness. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, and they sat like that until the storm passed, until the first gray light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pearl and smoke. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at her doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for not trying to fix it." After that night, something fundamental shifted in the architecture of their arrangement. They began having breakfast together, not by design but by gravitational pull, as if they'd become twin stars caught in each other's orbit. He told her about the hostile takeover attempt he was fighting, the board members who questioned his leadership, the weight of carrying a legacy he never wanted but couldn't abandon. She told him about her mother, about growing up poor in a rich city, about dreams of being an artist that died quietly under the crushing pressure of survival. "Show me," he said one evening, when she'd mentioned her abandoned paintings. "Show you what your art. I want to see it." She hadn't painted in 3 years, hadn't even looked at her old canvases since she'd shoved them into storage. But something in the way he asked, genuine curiosity without judgment, made her agree. The next day he had everything delivered to the penthouse, her entire collection, and when he unwrapped the first painting, a cityscape done in violent strokes of red and gold, she watched his face carefully, waiting for the polite dismissal. Instead, he stared at it for a long moment, then said, "This is extraordinary. Why did you stop?" "Because art doesn't pay for cancer treatments," she said, more bitterly than she intended. "What if it could?" He turned to her, and she saw something calculating in his expression, but not cold, strategic. "I'm hosting a fundraiser next month. Major donors, art collectors, people with more money than taste. What if we showcased your work? All proceeds go to medical research, but it gets your paintings in front of people who could launch your career." "That's not part of our deal. I'm renegotiating the terms," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in something that wasn't quite a smile but was close. "Consider it a bonus clause." She wanted to say no, to protect herself from hoping, but the way he looked at her paintings, the reverence in how he handled them, made her believe that maybe he saw something in her work that went beyond the transaction they'd built their marriage on. The gala preparation consumed the next 3 weeks. Dominic threw himself into promoting the event with the same intensity he brought to corporate acquisitions, while Elena painted frantically trying to create new pieces worthy of the opportunity. They fell into a rhythm that felt dangerously domestic. He'd bring her coffee at midnight when she was still working, stand behind her and watch the brushstrokes emerge, sometimes offering thoughts that were surprisingly insightful. She'd proof his speeches for the event, help him choose the right tone, the right words to move people toward generosity. One night, exhausted and pain-stained, she fell asleep on the couch in the living room, brushes still in hand. She woke to find herself covered with a blanket, her materials carefully cleaned and organized. Dominic was across the room, working on his laptop, but when he noticed her stirring, he looked up. "You talk in your sleep," he said casually. "Something about cobalt blue and broken mirrors. Sorry if I kept you awake." "You didn't." He closed the laptop, giving her his full attention in that focused way of his that made her feel like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "Elena, can I ask you something? Of course, when this is over, when the 2 years are up, what will you do? Where will you go?" The question hit her harder than it should have. She'd been so focused on getting through each day, on the immediate crisis of her mother's health, that she hadn't let herself think about what came after. The contract had seemed like a finish line, but now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness with this man who was supposed to be temporary, she realized she couldn't picture the after anymore. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe I'll finally take that trip to Barcelona I always dreamed about, open a small gallery, paint the Mediterranean. He nodded slowly, something unreadable crossing his features. That sounds perfect for you. What about you? She asked. What happens to Dominic Ashford when he doesn't need a fake wife anymore? I suppose I go back to being exactly what I was before, married to the company, alone in a penthouse full of expensive things that don't mean anything. He said it matter-of-factly, but she heard the hollowness underneath. That sounds terrible. It's what I signed up for. He stood stretching, and she noticed how tired he looked, shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there when they started this arrangement. Get some sleep, Elena. Big day tomorrow. But as he walked toward his room, she found herself saying, Dominic, wait. He turned. Don't have to be alone, you know? Even after this ends, you're allowed to want more than just the company. Something painful flickered across his face. Wanting things is dangerous. It makes you vulnerable. It gives the world something to take away. Maybe, she said softly. Or maybe it's what makes you human. The night of the gala arrived, wrapped in anticipation and nerves that felt electric. Elena stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing herself in the emerald gown Dominic's stylist had chosen, her hair swept up to reveal the curve of her neck. When she emerged from her room, Dominic was waiting in a tuxedo that transformed him from the casual, late-night version she'd grown comfortable with into something remote and untouchable again. But then he saw her, and his expression shifted into something she'd never seen before. Wonder, maybe even fear. You look, he started, then stopped, seemingly unable to find words adequate to finish the sentence. Acceptable, she offered, trying to lighten the sudden weight in the air between them. Devastating, he said quietly, and offered his arm. The Metropolitan Museum had been transformed into a wonderland of light and elegance, and Elena's paintings hung on the walls like prayers made visible. She watched from across the room as people examined her work, pointing, discussing, some even pulling out phones to photograph pieces. Dominic never left her side, his hand a constant warm pressure on the small of her back, and when collectors approached, he spoke about her art with such genuine passion that she almost believed he was a real husband, truly proud of his wife's talent. Mr. Ashford, a voice cut through the crowd, sharp and cold. Elena turned to see a silver-haired woman approaching, elegant and predatory in equal measure. Dominic's entire body went rigid. Grandmother, he said, his voice carefully neutral. The woman's gaze swept over Elena with surgical precision, dissecting, evaluating, finding every flaw. So this is the artist you've married. How very bohemian of you, Dominic. I trust she's aware of her responsibilities to the family legacy. Elena is an extraordinary talent, Dominic said, his voice hardening. And my marriage is not up for discussion. Everything you do is up for discussion when you bear the Ashford name. The grandmother's smile was glacial. I've received some very interesting information about the timeline of your relationship, how you met, the speed of your engagement. It all seems rather convenient, doesn't it? Almost contractual. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Dominic had gone absolutely still, the kind of stillness that comes before an explosion. I don't know what you're implying, he said carefully. Don't you? The old woman's eyes glittered with malice. I have lawyers too, Dominic. Very thorough ones. And I'm prepared to challenge your position in the company if I find that you've made a mockery of family values with some sort of arrangement. The board won't stand for deception. The threat hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Elena realized with sudden, crushing clarity that everything they'd built, every small moment of connection, every late-night conversation, was about to be torn apart by the very contract that had brought them together. The irony was devastating. But before she could speak, before she could even process what this meant, Dominic did something that changed everything. He turned to her, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. And in front of his grandmother, in front of the crowd of donors and socialites, he cupped her face in his hands with a tenderness that couldn't possibly be faked. I don't care what you investigate, he said to his grandmother, but his eyes never left Elena's face. Because whatever you find, it won't change the truth. I'm in love with my wife. The words hung in the air like a confession and a declaration and a revolution all at once. And Elena felt her entire world tilt on its axis as she realized that somewhere between the signatures on a contract and this moment, the rules they'd agreed to had become meaningless in the face of something neither of them had planned for. Something terrifying and real and completely outside the boundaries of what they'd promised each other would never happen. The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. The kind of silence that swallows sound and spits out consequences. Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare into Dominic's eyes and see the truth reflected there, raw and unguarded and utterly terrifying. His hands were still cradling her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a gentleness that made her heart fracture in her chest. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't clause 12, page 7. This was everything they'd promised not to let happen. His grandmother's sharp intake of breath cut through the moment like scissors through silk. You're making a mistake. Dominic, this girl is using you. Can't you see that? Wake up before you destroy everything your father would have wanted for you? Something dangerous flashed across Dominic's face at the mention of his father. He dropped his hands from Elena's face but caught one of her hands in his, threading their fingers together with deliberate intention. My father would have wanted me to be happy. Something you never understood. Something this family has never understood. The company isn't worth inheriting if I have to sacrifice my humanity to keep it. Then you're a fool, the old woman spat, and turned on her heel, cutting through the crowd like a blade through water. Elena's hand was trembling in his round them. The gala continued, oblivious to the small apocalypse that had just occurred. Music swelling, champagne flowing, people admiring her paintings without knowing the artist was currently experiencing an existential crisis dressed in emerald silk. Dominic turned to her, and she saw something fragile in his expression, something that looked like hope and fear wearing the same mask. We should talk, he said quietly, but not here. Can you hold on for another hour? Smile and pretend everything is fine? She almost laughed at the irony. They'd been pretending for months. What was one more hour? But this pretending felt different, heavier, because now she knew that what she'd been feeling in the quiet moments, the early mornings, the late-night conversations, wasn't one-sided. He'd felt it too. He'd named it out loud where it could be heard, where it could do damage, where it could ruin everything they'd carefully constructed. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Elena moved through the crowd on autopilot, accepting congratulations on her work, smiling at collectors who wanted to purchase her paintings, nodding at conversations she wouldn't remember 5 minutes later. Dominic stayed close, his presence a constant gravity pulling at her, and every time she glanced at him, she found him already looking at her with an expression that made her stomach twist with something she was too afraid to name. They sold every single painting. The fundraiser raised 3 times the projected amount. By all measurable standards, the night was a triumph, but all Elena could think about was the ride home, the conversation waiting for them, the question hovering between them that could destroy the fragile peace they'd built or transform it into something neither of them knew how to navigate. The car ride back to the penthouse was suffocating in its silence. Their driver kept his eyes on the road, professional and invisible, while Elena and Dominic sat separated by 12 inches of leather seat that might as well have been the Grand Canyon. She could feel the words building in him, pressing against his composure like water against a dam, and she wasn't sure if she wanted the dam to break or hold. When they finally stepped into the penthouse, the city sprawling below them in its infinite glitter, Dominic loosened his tie with jerky, frustrated movements and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. He downed half of it, then set the glass on the bar with a controlled precision that told Elena he was holding himself together by threads. I shouldn't have said that, he began, his back still to her. I put you in an impossible position. My grandmother will investigate, and she'll find the contract, and everything will come apart. Your money, your mother's treatment, all of it. I'm sorry, that's what you're worried about, Elena heard herself say, her voice sharper than intended. The contract. He turned to face her, and in the low lighting of the penthouse, he looked like a different person than the man who'd signed those papers 4 months ago. Softer, more real, more breakable. What else would I be worried about? Maybe whether or not you meant it. The words came out quieter than she'd planned, but they landed heavy in the space between them. His jaw tightened. Elena, because if you did mean it, if you actually feel what you said you feel, then we have a much bigger problem than your grandmother's lawyers. And if you didn't mean it, if it was just strategy, just another move in the chess game you're always playing, then I need to know that right now. It wasn't strategy, he said roughly. God, Elena, nothing about you has been strategy for weeks now, maybe longer, maybe from the beginning. I don't know anymore. All I know is that somewhere between the contract and tonight, you became the thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I want to see before I sleep. And that terrifies me because I don't know how to do this, how to want something this much when wanting things has only ever led to loss. The confession hung between them, vulnerable and sharp-edged, and Elena felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been carefully protecting since the day she signed her name on that contract. She'd told herself it was just proximity, just the natural byproduct of playing house with someone attractive and damaged and brilliant. She'd told herself she could walk away clean when the 2 years ended, take her money and her mother's health and start over without looking back. But she'd been lying to herself. She'd been lying for months. I'm in love with you too, she whispered, and watched him close his eyes like the words caused physical pain. And you're right, it's a problem, because the contract says no emotional involvement, and we've already violated that in every way possible. And I don't know what happens now. Do we pretend we didn't say these things? Do we just keep going through the motions until the time runs out? No, he said immediately, crossing the room to her in 3 long strides. No, I can't do that. I can't spend the next year and a half pretending I don't feel this when you're right there, when I could just reach out and touch you, when I could kiss you properly instead of those sterile performances for cameras. Then what do we do? She looked up at him, and the distance between them was measured in inches and impossibilities. We tear up the contract, he said. We start over. We do this right, without rules or timelines or financial incentives, just you and me. figuring out if what we feel in this pressure cooker of an arrangement translates to something real in the actual world. It should have been perfect. It should have been the moment where the music swells and the credits roll and everyone goes home satisfied. But Elena felt cold dread pooling in her stomach, because she knew what tearing up the contract meant. No money, no guarantee. Her mother's treatment hanging by a thread while she gambled on feelings that might evaporate the moment the structure supporting them disappeared. "I can't," she said, and watched hope die in his eyes. "Dominic, my mother has maybe 6 months left. The treatments are the only thing keeping her alive. If I walk away from the contract, if I don't fulfill the terms, I lose everything I did this for in the first place. Can you understand that?" "Then we wait," he said. "We finish the 2 years. We keep up the appearance, but we know, between us, that it's real. That when it's over, we're not walking away from each other. And if your grandmother proves the contract was fake, if she convinces the board to remove you, what then?" His face hardened. "Then I lose the company my father died building. The legacy I've spent my entire adult life protecting. But Elena, I'm starting to think maybe that's a price I'm willing to pay." "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't make me responsible for that choice. Don't put that weight on me. I've carried enough weight for both of us." The words came out harsher than she meant, and she saw him flinch. The air between them had turned toxic, all the confession and vulnerability curdling into resentment and fear. They were two people drowning, each trying to save the other while their own heads kept slipping under the water. "You're right," he said finally, voice flat. "I'm sorry. This is too much, too fast. We should just go to bed and figure it out tomorrow." But as he turned away, Elena felt panic claw at her throat. They were about to retreat to their separate corners, to go back to the careful distance they'd maintained before everything shifted. And she knew with sudden, crushing certainty that if they did that, they'd never find their way back to this moment of honesty, no matter how painful it was. "Wait," she said, grabbing his arm. "Don't go. Please don't go." He stopped, his muscles tense under her fingers. "Elena, what do you want from me? Tell me what you want and I'll do it. I'll wait, I'll pretend, I'll keep my distance, whatever you need. Just tell me." What did she want? She wanted her mother healthy. She wanted financial security. She wanted to paint without the crushing anxiety of poverty breathing down her neck. She wanted all the practical, sensible things that had driven her to sign the contract in the first place. But she also wanted this man, wanted his late-night conversations and his terrible coffee and the way he looked at her paintings like they were prayers. She wanted the impossible thing, the both and instead of the "I want you to kiss me," she said. "For real this time, not for cameras or appearances or grandmothers watching, just because you want to." His eyes darkened with something that looked like hunger and hesitation tangled together. "If I kiss you, I won't want to stop. And we haven't figured out any of the practical problems. We're still stuck in the same mess we were 5 minutes ago." "I know," she said, "but I'm tired of being practical. I've been practical my entire life, and it's gotten me a dying mother and a marriage that's not a marriage and paintings I was too afraid to show anyone. So kiss me, Dominic. Let's be impractical for once." He studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him making calculations, weighing consequences, doing the mental math that probably kept him up at night. But then something shifted in his expression, something that looked like surrender, and he cupped her face in his hands again. This time with intention that had nothing to do with performances or grandmothers or contracts. "This changes everything," he warned, his thumb tracing her bottom lip. "I know," she breathed. He kissed her like a man coming up for air after drowning, desperate and careful and absolutely certain. His mouth was warm and tasted like whiskey and promises neither of them knew how to keep. And Elena felt herself melting into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. The city glittered below them, oblivious while they rewrote every rule they'd set for themselves in a law office 4 months ago. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to have to figure this out," he said. "My grandmother, the contract, all of it. I know," she whispered. "But not tonight. Not tonight," he agreed. But even as he kissed her again, even as she let herself get lost in the feeling of being wanted for something more than what she could provide, Elena felt the cold finger of dread tracing down her spine, because she knew with the terrible clarity that comes from years of survival, that love alone wouldn't solve the practical problems crushing them from all sides. And worse, she was starting to suspect that the contract that had brought them together might be the very thing that would tear them apart, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of stolen moments and mounting pressure. Elena woke each morning tangled in sheets that smelled like cedar and smoke, Dominic's arm heavy across her waist, and for those first few seconds before full consciousness returned, she let herself believe they were just two people in love, untethered to contracts or consequences. But then reality would seep in with the morning light, and she'd remember the ticking clock, the grandmother's threat, the impossibility of their situation. They tried to maintain normalcy, whatever that meant for two people who'd built their marriage on legal documents and were now trying to retrofit genuine emotion into the framework. Dominic still went to the office, still fought battles with his board of directors who were circling like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. Elena still called the hospital every day, tracking her mother's vitals like some people tracked stock prices, each stable reading a small victory against the inevitable. But now, when Dominic came home late, he'd find her in the living room instead of her separate bedroom, and they'd talk until the city quieted below them, sharing pieces of themselves that hadn't been part of the original agreement. He told her about the pressure of being groomed for leadership before he understood what childhood was supposed to be, about nannies who were warmer than his own mother, about a grandmother who measured love in quarterly profits and family loyalty in shares of stock. She told him about her father who'd left when she was 6, about learning to shoplift groceries at 10, about her mother working 3 jobs and still coming up short, about the specific shame of wearing second-hand clothes to a school full of children who spent more on haircuts than Elena's family spent on rent. They were building something real in the ruins of something fake, but the foundation was cracked, and they both knew it. 2 weeks after the gala, Dominic's assistant called an emergency meeting. Elena was in the middle of sketching a new piece, charcoal on her fingers, when she heard his voice in the hallway, tight with controlled fury. She emerged to find him pacing the living room like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his hair in a gesture she'd learned meant he was barely holding it together. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "Find out who leaked it and make sure they understand the consequences of breaking confidentiality agreements." He ended the call and threw the phone onto the couch with enough force that it bounced. "What happened?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew, had been expecting it since the night his grandmother had issued her threat. "Someone leaked information about our marriage to the business press," he said, his voice deadly calm in that way that meant he was actually furious. "Not the contract itself. They're too smart for that, but enough details to make it look suspicious. The timeline, the speed of the courtship, your financial situation before we married. They're painting you as a gold digger and me as a fool, and the board is using it as ammunition to question my judgment." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I have an emergency board meeting tomorrow. They're calling for a vote of no confidence." He stopped pacing and looked at her, and she saw fear in his eyes. Real fear, maybe for the first time since she'd known him. "If I lose the vote, I'm out. Everything my father built, everything I've spent 15 years protecting, gone. What do we do?" She crossed to him, took his hands in hers, felt them trembling slightly. "You don't do anything," he said. "This is my problem, my family, my company, my mess." "It's our mess," she corrected. "We're in this together, remember, for better or worse. That's what we promised, even if we meant it differently then than we do now." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she felt his breath shudder against her neck. They stood like that for a long time, two people clinging to each other while the world tried to tear them apart, and Elena thought about how love was supposed to be the thing that saved you, but sometimes it was just another weight you carried, another thing that could crush you if you weren't careful. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay beside Dominic, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, and stared at the ceiling while her mind raced through possibilities. If he lost the company, he'd lose everything that defined him, everything he'd built his identity around. He'd become exactly what his grandmother predicted, a man who'd sacrificed legacy for love, and eventually, he'd resent her for it. Maybe not immediately, maybe not consciously, but resentment was patient, and it would grow in the spaces between them until there was nothing left but bitterness. But if she left, if she walked away and claimed the contract had been fulfilled early, if she took whatever money she could negotiate and disappeared, he'd keep the company. He'd keep his legacy. He'd keep being Dominic Ashford CEO, instead of Dominic Ashford, the man who lost everything for a woman he barely knew. The thought made her physically sick, but she couldn't stop turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle like a puzzle piece that might fit if she just rotated it the right way. She must have eventually fallen asleep, because she woke to sun streaming through the windows and Dominic already gone, a note on his pillow that read simply, "Board meeting. I'll call you after. I love you." 3 words that should have filled her with warmth but instead felt like an anchor pulling her under. Elena spent the morning trying to distract herself with painting, but her hands wouldn't cooperate, her brush strokes too aggressive, the colors all wrong. She finally gave up and called the hospital, spoke with her mother's nurse, learned that there'd been a setback overnight, that they'd had to adjust medications again, that the doctor wanted to discuss next steps being code for the conversation about hospice, about comfort care, about admitting that the war was lost and all that remained was managing the retreat. She was still on the phone, still trying to hold herself together while the nurse explained the medical details in that professionally gentle voice healthcare workers used when delivering bad news. When the penthouse door opened, Dominic walked in, and she knew immediately from his face that the board meeting had gone as badly as they'd feared. Elena ended the call and stood, waiting, watching him remove his jacket with mechanical precision, loosen his tie, pour himself a drink even though it was barely noon. He downed the whiskey in one swallow and poured another. "They voted," he said finally, his voice hollow. 15-8. "I have 30 days to prove the marriage is legitimate and not some scheme to manipulate the family trust, or I'm out. My grandmother's lawyers have already filed a formal challenge. They want financial records, phone logs, witness testimonies. They're going to tear apart every moment of our relationship looking for proof it was fake. And they'll find it, Elena said quietly. Because it was fake. The contract exists. Multiple witnesses saw us sign it. I've already spoken with my lawyers. There are arguments we can make, technicalities we can exploit. The contract never explicitly says the marriage is fake, just that it's time limited. We could argue it was a prenuptial agreement with unusual terms. We could stop, she interrupted. Just stop, listen to yourself. You're already strategizing, already trying to find the loopholes, already treating this like a business problem to solve. But it's not, it's our lives. He set down his glass carefully. I'm trying to save us. Are you? She heard her voice rising, felt control slipping. Or are you trying to save the company? Because from where I'm standing, they're not the same thing anymore. That's not fair. None of this is fair. She shot back. My mother is dying. Your grandmother is destroying you. We're trapped in a marriage that started as a lie and turned into something real. But the lie is still there, still rotting the foundation. And we can't just pretend it doesn't exist. Then what do you want me to do? He was angry now too, matching her energy. Give up. Just surrender the company and let my grandmother win. Let everyone who doubted me be proven right. I want you to be honest about what this is costing us, she said. About what it's costing me. I gave up everything to be here. My independence, my dignity, my ability to say I married for love instead of money. And now we're supposed to parade our relationship in front of lawyers and judges and prove it's real. How do we do that without destroying what's actually real between us? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference, millions of lives being lived in parallel. None of them knowing or caring that in this penthouse, two people were discovering that love alone couldn't solve the practical problem of survival in a world that measured worth in dollars and contracts. Dominic's phone buzzed and he glanced at it, his face going even paler. It's the hospital, he said quietly, handing it to her. They called me when they couldn't reach you. Elena took the phone with numb fingers and returned the call. The nurse's voice was gentle but firm. There'd been another complication. Her mother had requested to speak with her. It was important. It couldn't wait. She ended the call and looked at Dominic, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. They both knew what it couldn't wait meant. Her mother's time was running out faster than expected. And suddenly the 2-year timeline, the contract terms, the board meeting, all of it seemed absurdly distant compared to the immediate reality that she was about to lose the person who'd given her life, who'd sacrificed everything so Elena could have chances she never had. I have to go, she said. I'll come with you. No, she said it more sharply than intended, softened it. No, I need to do this alone. I need to talk to her without witnesses, without thinking about how it looks or what it means for the contract. He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have stopped him. He just nodded and said, call me if you need anything, anything at all. The hospital was a 40-minute drive through traffic that crawled like a living thing. Elena sat in the back of the car watching the city slide past, thinking about all the moments that had led her to this point. The day her mother was diagnosed. The mounting bills. The stranger's phone call offering a solution wrapped in silk and lined with thorns. The law office. The contract. Dominic's gray eyes meeting hers across mahogany wood, the first crack in the wall between them. The kiss that changed everything. Her mother looked smaller than Elena remembered, swallowed by hospital blankets and machinery, but her eyes were still sharp, still seeing too much. She gestured weakly for Elena to come closer, and when Elena took her hand, the bones felt like a bird's wing, delicate and breakable. Mia, her mother said, her voice raspy from medication. Tell me the truth, are you happy? The question was so unexpected that Elena almost laughed. Happy? What did happiness even mean in the context of everything falling apart? But she looked at her mother's face, saw the genuine concern there, and realized this was what mattered to her mother in these final days. Not the money, not the treatment, not even her own survival. Just whether her daughter had found something worth more than sacrifice. I don't know, Elena admitted. I married him for the money to save you, but somewhere along the way, I fell in love with him. And now I don't know which came first anymore, the transaction or the feeling, and I don't know if it matters. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they were wet. Your father left because I wouldn't give up my principles for his comfort. He wanted me to be someone I wasn't, and I couldn't do it, so he walked away. I raised you alone and poor, and I told myself it was worth it because at least I had integrity. But watching you now, I wonder if I taught you the wrong lesson. If I made you think love and survival were incompatible, Mama. Let me finish. Her grip tightened with surprising strength. You don't have to choose between being practical and being happy. You don't have to sacrifice one for the other. Whatever happens with this marriage, with this man, make sure it's what you truly want, not what you think you owe me or him or anyone else. I'm dying, Elena, and when I'm gone, you'll be left with the choices you made and the life those choices created. Make sure it's a life you can live with. The words settled over Elena like snow, quiet and heavy, and she realized her mother was giving her permission. Permission to walk away from the contract if she wanted. Permission to stay if she wanted. Permission to stop carrying the weight of her mother's medical bills as if they were a debt that could only be repaid with her own happiness. What if I can't have both? Elena whispered. What if keeping him means losing everything else? Her mother's smile was sad and knowing. Then you'll find out what you're really made of. Just like I did when your father left. Just like every woman before us who had to choose between heart and hunger. There's no right answer, Mia. Only the answer you can live with. Elena stayed until her mother fell asleep, holding her hand, watching machines track the slow decline of a heart that had beaten for 53 years and would stop soon, leaving Elena alone with choices she didn't want to make. When she finally left the hospital, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and she felt something shift inside her, some fundamental understanding that had been missing before. She loved Dominic. That was real. But love didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in the context of bills and board meetings and dying mothers and contracts that promised money for performances. And sometimes love meant making the hard choice, the choice that hurt but was right, the choice that protected the other person even if it destroyed you in the process. By the time she got back to the penthouse, she knew what she had to do. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Dominic was waiting in the living room, and when he saw her face, he stood immediately, crossing to her. How is she? Dying, Elena said simply. She has weeks, maybe days. The doctor wants to discuss hospice. He pulled her into his arms, and she let herself lean into him one last time, breathed in that scent of cedar and smoke, memorized the feeling of being held by someone who knew all her broken pieces and wanted her anyway. I'm so sorry, he murmured into her hair. I know, she said, and then, pulling back to look at him, we need to talk about the contract Something flickered across Dominic's face, something that looked like understanding mixed with dread. He stepped back, putting distance between them, and she saw him building walls in real time, retreating into the version of himself that had signed those papers months ago, the one who believed protection came from keeping people at arm's length. Don't, he said quietly. Whatever you're about to say, don't. But Elena had carried enough weight for both of them, had made enough sacrifices, had been practical for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to choose something just because it was right. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, permission and warning tangled together, and she realized that the only way forward was through the hardest conversation they'd ever have. The contract was supposed to protect us both, she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. You got a wife to satisfy your grandmother and the board. I got money to save my mother. Clean transaction. No complications. But we complicated it, didn't we? We fell in love when that was explicitly against the rules, and now we're drowning because we're trying to honor an agreement that doesn't fit who we've become. So we break the agreement, Dominic said, desperation creeping into his voice. We tear it up. I told you I'm willing to do that, and lose the company. Watch your grandmother take everything your father built. Prove to the board that you're exactly the kind of impulsive, emotion-driven leader they fear you are. She shook her head. I won't let you sacrifice 15 years of work for me. I won't be the reason you lose your legacy. You're not a reason, you're a person I love, he said roughly, and that matters more than any company. Can't you see that? I've spent my entire life protecting something that was never mine to begin with. It was my father's dream, my grandmother's empire, the board's investment, but you're mine. What we have is mine, and I'm not giving it up to save a company that would destroy the woman I love to maintain its reputation. The words should have broken her. They should have made her cave, should have convinced her to stay and fight and damn the consequences. But all she could think about was the resignation in her mother's eyes, the machines keeping a worn-out heart beating a little longer, the hospital bills that would come due whether or not anyone was around to pay them. All she could think about was Dominic 5 years from now, working some middle management job, looking at her across a modest apartment and wondering if she was worth what he'd lost. The resentment would come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it would come, and it would poison everything beautiful they'd built in the ruins of a contract marriage. I'm going to testify, she said, and watched his face go pale at the board meeting. I'm going to tell them the truth about how we met, about the contract, about why I agreed to marry you. I'm going to give them exactly what they need to remove you from the company. The silence that followed was devastating. Dominic stared at her like she'd physically struck him, like he couldn't reconcile the words coming from her mouth with the woman who'd kissed him in the dark, who'd let him see her broken pieces, who'd said she loved him and meant it. You're going to destroy me, he said finally, his voice hollow. You're going to stand up in front of the board and my grandmother and tell them I was stupid enough to fall in love with someone I hired to play my wife. You're going to prove every terrible thing they believe about me. No, Elena said, tears finally breaking free, tracking down her face in hot lines. I'm going to set you free, because if I testify, if I take responsibility for the contract and claim I manipulated you, they'll remove you from the company, but they'll also see you as a victim of circumstance. Your grandmother can't use you as an example of failed judgment if everyone believes you were deceived. You'll lose the company, yes, but you'll keep your reputation. You'll keep the possibility of building something new, something that's actually yours instead of inherited obligation. I don't want something new, he said, and she heard his voice crack. I want you, I want this. I want what we've been building together. We built it on a foundation of lies, she said softly. And sooner or later, that foundation was going to collapse and take us both down with it. This way, at least one of us survives. He crossed to her then, fast, grabbing her arms with enough force that she gasped. His eyes were wild, desperate, nothing like the controlled man who'd signed those papers. This was the version of Dominic that hid beneath the suits and the strategy. The version that felt too much and protected himself by feeling nothing at all. You don't get to make this decision for me, he said. You don't get to sacrifice yourself and call it love. That's not love, Elena. That's martyrdom, and I won't let you do it. You don't have a choice, she said. I've already contacted your grandmother's lawyers. I have a meeting with them tomorrow. I'm going to give them a signed statement that confirms every suspicion they have about the contract. With or without your permission, I'm doing this. She watched realization hit him like a physical blow. His hands dropped from her arms. He stepped back. The distance between them suddenly felt like miles instead of inches, an unbridgeable gap opening up where intimacy had been moments before. Why? The word came out broken. If you love me, why would you do this? Because I love you, she said simply. Because my mother is dying and she taught me that sometimes love means choosing someone else's future over your present happiness. Because you deserve a life that isn't built on contracts and compromises. Because I'd rather lose you and know you're free than keep you and watch resentment slowly kill what we feel. That's not your choice to make. Yes, it is, she said quietly. It was always my choice. From the moment I signed that contract, I held all the power. I was the variable, the unknown quantity, the risk factor your grandmother couldn't account for. And now I'm using that power to give you back your life. Dominic turned away from her, walked to the windows overlooking the city. His reflection in the glass looked ghostly, insubstantial, like he was already disappearing. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. I've spent my entire life being practical, making the smart choice, protecting the legacy, building the empire. And the one time I let myself be impractical, the one time I let myself want something just because I wanted it. You're taking it away because you think you're protecting me. He laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. The irony is almost beautiful, Dominic. No, he cut her off, still not turning around. You've made your decision. You've decided what's best for both of us without consulting me, without giving me any say in my own future. So let me make one decision for myself. He finally turned, and his face was a mask of controlled devastation. When you testify tomorrow, when you destroy everything we built, do it knowing that I will never forgive you for this. Not because you're wrong about the consequences, but because you didn't trust me enough to let me choose my own destruction. The words hit her like bullets, each one finding its mark. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? For him to hate her, to let her go, to move on without the weight of what they'd almost had pulling him under. But knowing it was right didn't make it hurt any less. I can live with that, she said, even though she wasn't sure it was true. Can you? He crossed back to her, got close enough that she could see the fury and hurt and love all tangled together in his expression. Can you really live knowing you had something real, something rare, and you threw it away because you were too afraid to fight for it? I'm fighting for you, she insisted. This is me fighting. No, he said. This is you running. Just like you've run from everything that scared you your entire life. You ran from your art career. You ran into a contract marriage instead of facing poverty head-on. And now you're running from me because staying and fighting and possibly failing is scarier than leaving and calling it noble. The accusation stung because part of it was true. She had run. She'd spent her whole life in survival mode, making practical choices, protecting herself from disappointment by never hoping for too much. Even marrying Dominic had been a calculated risk, a transaction with defined parameters and expected outcomes. Falling in love with him had been the first truly impractical thing she'd ever done, and now she was trying to make it practical again, trying to control the damage, trying to ensure that at least one of them walked away intact. Maybe I am running, she admitted. Maybe I'm terrified that if we try to make this work, if we fight your grandmother and the board and all the practical reasons we shouldn't be together, we'll fail anyway, and the failure will be so much worse than if I just end it now, cleanly. While we still remember it as something beautiful instead of something that destroyed us both. Dominic's expression softened slightly, and he reached up to touch her face, his thumb catching a tear. Elena, love isn't supposed to be practical. It's supposed to be terrifying and impossible and worth fighting for, even when you know you might lose. My father drowned trying to find freedom on the water. He died doing something he loved, being someone authentic. And I've spent 27 years playing it safe, being practical, protecting a legacy that I'm not even sure I want. Meeting you, falling in love with you, it was the first time I felt like I understood what he was searching for. Don't, she whispered. Don't make this harder than it already is. It should be hard, he said. If it's not hard, it's not real, and this is real. Elena, whatever started as a contract, whatever we pretended at the beginning, this thing between us is the most real thing I've ever felt. And I'm begging you, don't throw it away because you're trying to protect me from consequences I'm willing to accept. She wanted to cave. God. She wanted to let him convince her to stay and fight and believe that love could somehow overcome practical reality. but her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she knew without looking it was the hospital. Another update, another complication, another reminder that time was running out and fairy tales didn't pay medical bills or save dying mothers or protect the people you loved from the consequences of loving you back. "I have to go," she said, pulling away from his touch. "My mother needs me. We need you," he corrected. "I need you." "I know," she said, "but needing isn't enough. It never has been." She walked to the bedroom they'd shared for the past 2 weeks, the one that smelled like him and held memories of conversations that had lasted until dawn. She packed quickly, efficiently, shoving clothes into a suitcase without care for folding or organization. Dominic stood in the doorway watching her, and she could feel his gaze like a physical weight, but she didn't let herself look at him. If she looked at him, if she saw the devastation in his eyes, she'd break, and she couldn't afford to break, not yet, not while there was still work to do. "Where will you go?" he asked as she zipped the suitcase. "A hotel near the hospital. I need to be close to my mother. Let me at least pay for it." "No," she said firmly. "No more money, no more transactions. That's what got us into this mess." She finally forced herself to look at him, to memorize the lines of his face, the gray eyes that had seen through her defenses from the first day, the mouth that had kissed her like she was something precious. She wanted to tell him that this was killing her too, that walking away from him felt like amputating a limb, that she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what they could have been if circumstances had been different. But she didn't say any of that. She just said, "Goodbye, Dominic," and walked past him, through the penthouse that had been a cage and a sanctuary, through the door that clicked shut behind her with a finality that echoed in her chest. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a tomb. The lobby was bright and impersonal, the doorman nodding at her as if she was just another resident leaving for the evening, as if her entire world wasn't collapsing with each step she took away from the man she loved. The city swallowed her whole, and she let it The hotel room was small and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and other people's forgotten stays. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase still packed at her feet, and stared at nothing. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from Dominic that she couldn't bring herself to read, voicemails that accumulated like unpaid debts. She turned it off eventually, needing the silence more than she needed to know what he was saying, what arguments he was making, what final pleas he was offering into the void she'd created between them. The meeting with his grandmother's lawyers happened at 9 the next morning in an office that felt designed to intimidate, all dark wood and leather and framed degrees that announced competence and ruthlessness in equal measure. Elena sat across from 3 lawyers who looked at her like she was a specimen to be examined, a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized. She told them everything. The initial phone call from Dominic's assistant, the contract terms, the money promised for 2 years of performance, the separate bedrooms, the public appearances, the carefully maintained fiction. She signed the statement they'd prepared, watched them exchange satisfied looks, and felt something die inside her that she knew would never come back. "You understand," the lead lawyer said, her voice professionally neutral, "that by admitting this arrangement, you forfeit any claim to the contracted payment." The term stipulated successful completion of the full 2 years. Elena nodded. She'd known that would be the cost. Saving Dominic meant losing everything she'd entered the arrangement to gain. Her mother's treatment would have to be managed some other way. Medicaid, charity, prayer. The practical impossibilities she'd been running from her entire life were waiting for her like patient predators. "I understand," she said. She spent the afternoon at the hospital holding her mother's hand, telling her what she'd done without telling her why. Her mother listened with eyes that saw too much, that understood the sacrifice beneath the clinical recitation of facts. And when Elena finished, her mother squeezed her hand with what little strength remained. "You chose love," her mother whispered, "even if you're calling it something else." "I chose his future over mine," Elena corrected. "Same thing," her mother said, and closed her eyes, exhausted from the effort of consciousness. Elena sat there as afternoon bled into evening, watching machines breathe for her mother, thinking about choices and consequences and the unbearable weight of trying to save people who didn't ask to be saved. She thought about Dominic, about whether he'd heard yet about her testimony, about whether he understood that this was the only gift she knew how to give him. Freedom from the contract, freedom from her, freedom to build something that wasn't tainted by transactions and desperation. The call came 3 days later, not from Dominic, but from his assistant, professional and distant, requesting that Elena come to the penthouse to collect her remaining belongings. The board had voted. Dominic had been removed as CEO, but with a settlement package and his reputation largely intact. The narrative had shifted exactly as Elena had hoped. He was the brilliant executive who'd been manipulated by a woman desperate for money, a cautionary tale rather than a failure of judgment. His grandmother had won her war, but Dominic had survived the battle. Elena went to the penthouse during the middle of the day, when she knew he'd be out, when she could slip in and out like a ghost haunting her own former life. But when the elevator opened, he was there, waiting in the living room like he'd known she would come, like he'd been standing vigil for days just hoping she'd walk through that door one more time. He looked terrible. Shadows under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and his hair was uncombed in a way the old Dominic would never have allowed. He'd lost weight, his shirt hanging looser than it should, and when he looked at her, the devastation in his eyes was so complete she almost couldn't breathe. "You came," he said, his voice rough. "Just for my things," she managed. I know he didn't move from where he stood, maintaining distance like he was afraid getting too close would shatter what little composure he had left. "I wanted to tell you that I understand. Not forgive, not yet, maybe never, but understand." "You thought you were saving me. I was saving you," she said. "No," he corrected gently. "You were trying to control an outcome you were terrified of. You saw all the ways we could fail and decided to fail on your terms, quickly, before life could drag it out and make it more painful. I understand that because I've spent my entire life doing the same thing, controlling, planning, eliminating variables. You were just better at it than me. You eliminated yourself before I could." The words landed like truth, uncomfortable and precise. Elena felt something crack in her chest, some carefully maintained fiction about her own nobility, her own sacrifice. Maybe he was right. Maybe this had been less about saving him and more about protecting herself from the possibility of trying and failing anyway. "My mother died yesterday," she said abruptly, needing to shift the conversation to something concrete, something she could control. Early morning, she went peacefully. She watched pain flash across his face. "Elena, I'm so sorry. Why didn't you call me?" "Because we're not together anymore. Because I gave up the right to call you and I testified against you. That's not how love works," he said quietly. "You don't get to decide you're alone just because you made a choice I disagreed with. You don't get to carry grief by yourself when someone who loves you wants to help bear the weight. You said you'd never forgive." "Me, I said a lot of things when I was angry and hurt and watching my life explode," he admitted. "But I never said I stopped loving you. Love doesn't have an off switch, Elena. Trust me, I've tried to find it." She wanted to go to him, to close the distance between them, to let herself be held while she mourned her mother and the life they'd almost built together. But she stayed rooted where she was, knowing that giving in would only make everything harder, would only postpone the inevitable second goodbye that would come when reality reasserted itself and they remembered all the reasons this couldn't work. "The company gave me a settlement," Dominic continued. "Enough that I could start something new, build something that's actually mine instead of inherited obligation. And I've been thinking about what that could look like. What I want to build now that I'm free from my grandmother's expectations and the board's requirements and the weight of my father's legacy." He paused. "I keep coming back to art galleries, to spaces where people can take risks and show work that matters, work that tells the truth about being human. I keep thinking about your paintings, about how they made me feel something I'd forgotten how to feel." "Don't," she whispered. "Don't what?" "Don't tell you that you inspired something in me that goes beyond our failed arrangement. Don't tell you that losing the company was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to figure out who Dominic Ashford is when he's not trying to live up to a dead father's expectations." He finally moved, crossing to her slowly, carefully, like approaching something wild that might bolt. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to fix what you think you broke. I'm just telling you that you changed me, and that matters, and I'm grateful for it even though it hurt." Elena felt tears tracking down her face, hot and unstoppable. "I was trying to do the right thing. I know," he said. "And maybe you did. Maybe we needed to blow everything up to figure out what was real and what was performance. Maybe the contract had to end badly for anything authentic to grow from the rubble." He reached up, hesitated, then gently wiped away one of her tears with his thumb. "But here's what I learned from losing everything. The company, the reputation, the carefully constructed life. None of it mattered as much as the moments we had together. The late-night conversations, the way you looked at the city like it was a painting you were still learning to interpret. The storm, the first real kiss. Those things mattered more than quarterly profits or board approval or my grandmother's legacy." "That's easy to say now," Elena said, "when it's already lost." "Is it lost?" He asked the question quietly, seriously, and she realized he was giving her something she'd never given him. A choice, not a sacrifice or a strategy or a noble gesture, but an actual choice about what came next. She thought about her mother's words, about choosing between heart and hunger, about making decisions you could live with. She thought about the past months, about how the best version of herself had emerged, not despite the contract but because of it, because Dominic had seen her art and her ambition and her desperate love for her mother and hadn't flinched from any of it. She thought about how love stories were supposed to be simple, but real love never was. Real love was complicated and messy and required choosing the same person over and over again, even when it would be easier to walk away. "I don't have any money," she said finally. "No job, no prospects, no way to contribute equally to whatever we'd tried to build together. I'd be dependent on you, and that terrifies me more than almost anything." "Then don't be dependent," he said simply. "Sell your paintings, build a career. I'll support you while you do it. Not because you're my responsibility, but because investing in your talent is the smartest thing I could do with my money. Consider it a business arrangement if that makes it easier. I fund your art career. You give me a percentage of sales. Clean transaction. No complications." Despite everything, she almost smiled. "We're terrible at clean transactions with no complications." "We are," he agreed. We complicate everything we touch, but maybe that's okay. Maybe complications are just another word for depth, for meaning, for building something that matters instead of something that's just efficient. He took her hand, the same hand he'd held during that first storm, and she felt the rightness of it, the way they fit together, despite all the reasons they shouldn't. I'm not asking you to marry me again. We already did that, and it turned into a disaster. But I'm asking if you want to try something even scarier. Dating, getting to know each other without contracts or timelines or financial incentives. Just a people who fell in love under complicated circumstances trying to figure out if what they feel survives outside the pressure cooker. Elena looked at him, really looked, and saw not the CEO or the legacy or the wounded man she'd been trying to save. She saw Dominic, flawed and damaged and brilliant and kind, someone who'd lost everything and was offering her a future built on nothing but hope and possibility, and a belief that they could be better together than apart. My mother would have liked you, she said softly. The real you, not the version you performed for the world. I wish I could have known her better, he said. She told me something before she died. She said I didn't have to choose between being practical and being happy, that they weren't mutually exclusive. Elena squeezed his hand. I think maybe she was wrong. I think sometimes you do have to choose. And I think I've been choosing practical my entire life, and it got me survival but not living. So maybe it's time to choose different. What are you choosing? Dominic asked, and she heard the vulnerability in his voice, the fear that she'd choose practical one more time, that she'd walk away and call it wisdom. I'm choosing terrifying, she said. I'm choosing complications. I'm choosing you, if you'll have me. Not because of a contract or money or strategy, but because you make me want to paint again. And that's worth more than safety ever was. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like they were starting over from the beginning. Like this was a first kiss instead of a continuation of something that had started in a law office and survived its own destruction. And maybe it was. Maybe this was the real beginning. The moment they chose each other freely instead of out of necessity. The moment love became something they built together instead of something that happened to them. When they finally pulled apart, Dominic rested his forehead against hers and said, For what it's worth, I think your mother was right. Practical and happy aren't mutually exclusive, but you have to define practical on your own terms, not the world's terms. And maybe us being together, as messy and complicated as it is, maybe that's the most practical choice either of us could make. Because I'm better when you're here. And I think, maybe, you're better when I'm here too. Maybe, Elena agreed, and let herself smile, really smile, for the first time in weeks. They stood there in the penthouse that had been a stage and a prison and a home, the city glittering below them in the afternoon light. And Elena thought about how stories were supposed to have clear endings, neat resolutions, lessons that could be summed up in a sentence. But real life wasn't a story. It was just a series of choices, each one leading to more choices. An infinite branching tree of possibilities where the only constant was uncertainty. The contract marriage rules had meant nothing to the romance that grew, but maybe that was the point. Maybe rules and strategies and carefully constructed arrangements had never been the answer. Maybe all any of them could do was take the leap, risk the fall, and trust that love was enough of a safety net to catch them if they stumbled. 6 months later, Elena's first solo exhibition opened in a small gallery in Brooklyn. Her paintings hung on white walls that caught the light just right, people moving through the space with wonder and recognition. Dominic stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, and when someone asked how they'd met, she told them the truth. Contract marriage, she said, watching the surprise on their faces. We were supposed to pretend for 2 years. We made it for months before it got real. Best contract I ever signed, Dominic added, pulling her close, and maybe that was the real lesson. That sometimes the most unexpected transactions lead to the most genuine connections. That love doesn't follow rules or honor contracts or respect the boundaries we set to protect ourselves. That the coldest arrangements can burn the brightest if we're brave enough to let them. The question isn't whether love conquers all. The question is whether we're willing to be conquered by it, to let it remake us into people who choose connection over safety, vulnerability over control, hope over the comfortable certainty of guarded hearts. Elena had chosen, and in the choosing, she'd found not just Dominic but herself,